The virtual reality experiment. A few years before the time of this writing, there was an experiment to test a phenomenal invention. If the test was successful, it could have potentially revolutionized the world of video games forever. The invention was a virtual reality gaming console that would actually put eager players into the game so they could vividly experience it instead of just play it. It sounded like something from an unrealistic science fiction, but the developers had spent years building it and made sure it was ahead of the rest of the gaming industry by far. The console was to be called Immersion, and it would have instantly made every other console obsolete. It wasn't like the kind of system where you have to wear the visor over your eyes like the Oculus Rift, and still hold the controller. It would have generated an entire virtual world, unlike any other before. It's for players to explore. The game would generate sounds, smells, sights, even temperature. Once the gamer began playing it, it was as if they had stepped into another world of adventure. Sometimes the game would give them items to use, and there would be people inside the game to interact with. People who would wander around the world. Heroes, villains, and neutrals. The game would have great situations, and the player would have to solve them. The immersion actually put the player into the story. It was an advanced piece of technology, far beyond today's limitations, and it held a certain tempting beauty to it that attracted almost every major business to hear of it. The way the immersion worked was by getting into your head. Basically, the system would put you in a sleep-like condition and control the dreams you had. It was a complicated and very sophisticated device. The only thing the players had as a controller was the helmet over the heads for the machine to work. Anyone who was wearing the helmet should have only moved a little bit while playing the game in the curious sensation known as sleepwalking, similar to how they would in actual slumber. If you had died or lost the game, the immersion would simply wake you up. Only 3 games were made for the immersion, and the games took almost as much time to make as the console itself. Tests were required to make sure the game worked properly, so researchers were hired to examine the console. However, developers wanted to keep the invention a secret, so that no other company could steal their idea or make a console to rival with the immersion, which was highly unlikely. The researchers found 3 people to play the 3 games developed by the system. Their names were Mark, Luke, and Wayne, and each of them was a devoted gamer. The researchers let them pick the games they played after an explanation about each game. There was a game called War Worlds, which was a shooting game. The player would have started in a helicopter, wearing a full standard issue army uniform. They had just enough time to look around and sleek back interior of the helicopter, with the pilot and co-pilot chairs in the front, a wooden crate next to the player on the floor, and the door to the helicopter wide open, revealing a height so high to the ground was scarily visible. After a moment of looking around, the pilot would told them to grab a parachute, a gun from a crate, and then jump out of the helicopter. The immersion would have made it all to more terrifying than pressing a button and walking forward. It would make the players smell the air at a high altitude and feel the overpowering strength of the helicopter's blades as they stood in the doorway, staring down at the earth with a layer of dust concealing ground. And then the player would fall from the helicopter just before a missile was fired to shoot the helicopter down behind them as they fell to the ground. The player would actually feel the heat and explosion scraping their back. The explosion would have been deafeningly loud and scattering flaming helicopter pieces everywhere. The player would have to pull the rip cords off the parachute to land in the middle of the war zone with a gun they chose. Each soldier, friendly or enemy, would have custom faces, different stories and personalities, and different techniques. This was the game Mark would play. The next game was titled Diesel Drag, a racing game. It started with the player walking through a tunnel into a racing track, where there would be lines of racing cars, arranged all different types of models. All the player had to do was climb inside one and turn the key in the ignition. And then all of the other cars would suddenly have drivers in them, ready to race. There had been plenty of tracks designed. The racetracks ranged from a NASCAR type track to a forest drive, to wild public racing through the city. The immersion had also created a world of the racetrack in case players went off-road. The NASCAR track had spectators wandering around outside boundaries. The forest had trees and woodland animals, and the city had individual shops with different people inside. This was the game that Luke would play. The third and final game developed for the immersion was the most vivid of them all. The developers saw an opportunity to make a horror game, an actual scary one, unlike any made before, and they decided to make one for the immersion. Hours of time went into making the monster look intimidating and frightening, and weeks went into creating how he would behave in the game. The game was called The Aberrant. The player would begin strapped to a table, and they would have to find their arms tied down. If they struggled, the player would find their right arm was loose and possibly to twist out of the binds. The room was empty, aside from a table. Looking around, the player would see that the room was a perfect square, with stone walls and an iron door. After about 20 seconds, a white-haired man would enter the room with a long butcher knife. If the player was free or nearly free, he would attack. If the player appeared to still be strapped down, he would stand over them and begin whispering about how much he would love to see the blades entering their flesh over psychotic things such as this. To make this moment more creepier, a few developers had extended conversations with numerous asylum inmates who had stabbed victims to death, only to get feel for the emotion required for this man. The player could overpower the man and knock him on the ground or push him past the escape. Either way, they had to get out of the room. Once they had escaped the room, the old man would call after them before the iron door slammed shut. "You won't escape! Come back, or I'll find you!" He turned out to be the monster. The player's goal was to navigate their way through a maze-like cave system while avoiding it. The developers had made sure that plenty of obstacles, objects and details into the maze. They were broken chairs to throw at the monster to slow it down, large tree roots growing out of the walls to force the player to climb or slide under, and piles of rocks and gravel to hide behind. But the monster was unrelenting and his bloodthirsty search. Wayne, who was apparently a horror addict, had practically begged to play this game. With every researcher and developer gathered in the large room, Mark, Luke and Wayne were strapped down to 3 tables before immersion helmets were placed on their heads. A button was pressed, and then the games were started. Within a minute, all 3 gamers had fallen in a sleep-like state, occasionally mumbling about "shoot that one" or "pass him," or sometimes kicking slightly. The immersion helmets were hooked up to 3 large television screens, so everybody could see what the gamers saw in the first-person view. The experiment was going almost exactly as planned, so the developers and researchers alike were preparing to celebrate. But then the celebration was cut tragically short. The gamers began to thrash around. Mark, who had been in the middle of the shooting of an enemy with his machine gun in Warworld, was now screaming, his cries growing in pitch every time he stopped to take breath. Terrified, the researchers jumped backwards as blood began to spurt from Mark's body. Small wounds that looked to be bullet holes had covered Mark's chest, and his screams began to die. In only a few moments, Mark had turned from an avid gamer into a bullet hole-filled corpse. Luke was jerking from side to side. His car in-game was going off track, and he was fighting to keep it on. He might have succeeded, but suddenly another race car came along and knocked him off the track. Luke had told the developers to put it on the forest track, the same track where the developers had chosen to put a large fenceless cliff overlooking on a long hill. Luke's car spun over and over again as it rolled off into a steep cliff down a hill. The car went into mid-air for a moment, and then it hit the ground with a terrible screech of metal. Luke's sleeping body quivered for a minute, and then there was a loud cracking sound in his neck, snapped along with other bones. All was still, and then the car exploded. Luke's body erupted into flames, and researchers were astounded by this suddenly, spontaneously human combustion. A few ran out for a fire extinguisher, but all that remained of Luke was a black hunk of meat and a burning smell. At that point, developers and researchers alike were trying to stop the game Wayne was playing. If they had simply pulled off his helmet, Wayne's brain might have been permanently damaged. They could turn off the game. They couldn't turn off the game, and could only watch Wayne play. Wayne's arm had been cut while escaping the old man with the beginning of the game, and a thick gash appeared in reality, staining his shirt sleeve with blood. After escaping the old man, Wayne was now running for his life down the caves. The monster roared, echoing behind him, and the distant darkness at the end of the tunnel. Wayne found himself in a large open area. He looked around for a few seconds, and then came the sound from the thundering footsteps. He cast a quick, frightened glance into the tunnel he had just emerged from, and then looked around the area again. There was a large rock over the other side, and Wayne quickly scrambled behind it. He froze, trying not to even breathe as the footsteps entered the room. There was the sound of the monster sniffing. Wayne stared at the sound, hardly daring to move the slightest bit. The monster stopped, and there was a silence. Wayne carelessly began to raise his head to look up from the top of the rock. There was no sound. Suddenly, a large clawed hand shot down over the top of the rock. There was a loud growl, and Wayne screamed. The claws managed to seize him around his chest and pulled him from the hiding spot. In reality, Wayne's body opened up with more scratching, leaking even more blood. The monster hoisted him to the air and then threw him against the ground. Wayne looked up and got a glimpse of the monster. Its face resembled a human skull, having 2 dark eyes and a stubby nose. The eyes held 2 green orbs, and the cuts through Wayne's like hunter's eyes. The monster had a mouth like a gaping chasm with a long, sharp teeth. Its body was large and brown with long legs. Long appendages grew from under his arms, wrapping around Wayne and pulling him into the air upside down. Wayne screamed and pulled his arms in front of him and put his arms in front of him as some sort of defense. And then the monster's mouth opened wide and pulled Wayne into itself before the mouth closed, chomping the man as though he were nothing more than a piece of bread. In reality, Wayne's body fell open, exposing a broken skull, and immediately inside, the lifeless eyes still remained in its head, staring out of his holes of the skull. A few people vomited. In the game, the monster threw Wayne down. The green lights of his eyes died, reducing them to pure black. The monster on the TV screen looked at the developers with its dark horse. A thick, black sludge began to fall from his eyes and to the floor. Its mouth slowly fell open, releasing even more of the sludge. Almost everybody watching the experiment, developers and researchers, immediately fled the room. Those who remained, only 5 people, watched the monster slowly turn its head to the side as it started before the TV finally shut off. All records of the immersion have been destroyed, and it is as though it never happened. Nothing like it has ever been attempted since then again. A year after the experiment took place, all 5 people who had stayed within Wayne until the TV had turned off were found dead. Each of them was confirmed as suicide. The most chilling part about the suicides, other than the fact that they all took place the same day, was that each body was found next to the household television set, and each TV was turned nothing but static.